How's it going, everybody? The VMware Cloud Foundation is actually a pretty cool solution that VMware came out with quite some time ago. Been around for a while now. The latest release, as the last time I checked, was 4.5, and this happens to be a deployment of 4.4, which is through the vMug capability. So I have the vMug Advantage subscription, and then I have the eval experience. So it allows you to download a whole bunch of VMware products and licensing and things like that. This is not easy to get working in a home lab. I did a regular deployment. I didn't go through the VMware. There's a VLC, the lab connector, where you can do this. I did not do that, but that's like the next stage, sort of. So, but the whole point of me going through the rigmarole, and I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of what I did. It requires a lot of things to be deployed in order for things to work the way you need them to. I won't go into a ton of specifics, but I did take a ton of notes and try to get this working. It took about a week of monkeying around with settings and capabilities and uploads and tweaking the spreadsheet and things like that to try to get it to do what I wanted it to do. But eventually it worked. And SDDC Manager is one of those things where it's not something you just deploy and then you can manually start affixing things to it. It's something that's got to be deployed in an automated fashion. So for those of you that have watched me in the past deploy a ESXi host, deploy vCenter server, do the storage arrays, add the host to vCenter, then do the storage, the networking, all the things you need to do in order to get a basic implementation in place. Add your host to clusters, and then go deploy NSX Manager, join NSX Manager to vCenter, do all the NSX settings in order for it to do what it's supposed to do. Then do the networking piece, add the edge clusters, and do all the routing, all that stuff. All of that is 100% automated. All you have to do is provide the details in an Excel spreadsheet and then upload that spreadsheet to the cloud builder through the spreadsheet, or you can use a JSON file to do it, and then you're off to the races. It's actually a pretty cool capability, I'm not going to lie. So there's a couple different architectures that you can throw at this. You can do a consolidated architecture, meaning you will have ESXi hosts that are making up the management domain. The management domain is going to host vCenter server, your NSX-T cluster, your SDDC manager, and everything runs on top of vSAN. So you need to have vSAN ready to go and have a server that can support it and all those things. So I did that. Then there's another architecture known as the standard deployment, where you have additional hosts outside of the 4 initial ones that you deploy, and you end up rolling those your workload domains out on these new clusters. You usually deploy them in sets of 3, and for every you deploy a workload domain, and you're going to deploy another NSX-T cluster, so another 3-node cluster inside of the management domain, and that's going to be the NSX-T manager you're going to use for managing your workload domain NSX-T capabilities. There's going to be another vCenter that's going to be deployed in the management domain. So it's going to be the vCenter that manages your workload domain, but it's also going to be ELM, Enhanced Link Mode, connected to your vCenter that manages your management domain. And what's going to end up happening is you're going to have PSE connectivity and single sign-on, so you'll be able to see everything that's going on. It's kind of a pretty cool capability. Now, I was able to get a very, very small consolidated deployment working. Simply meaning, I went through and got the SDDC manager fully deployed, and there's a bunch of documentation online. If you want to go read up on it, I had a bunch of blog posts. It's a 16 to 20 hour deployment. It takes about a day for my lab in order for it to deploy what it needs to deploy. And it's a lot, and I'm not going to lie. It takes forever. It's not something I'm going to be able to put into a video. I did think about recording it, but the recording would probably be several gigs in size, and then I'd end up having to shrink that down. And it's just not feasible for me to record. So there are other people that have recorded their deployments, and the couple of video series that I've seen done, they're somewhere in the neighborhood of between 8 and 12 hours for the deployment. So in real hardware, you're looking at 3 or 4 hours, depending on the size of your implementation. So in this case here, I'm looking at about a day for the deployment. It probably wasn't quite a day. It was probably 12, 14, 16 hours. So for example, I get started like 9 o'clock in the morning. I get everything prepped and ready to go. And by 10 o'clock, I was ready to start doing my deployment. And it would just be sitting here just watching the screen go through all the little steps. And if there was a little hiccup, go figure out what the little hiccup was. And like I said, I took a ton of notes as to what it was that wasn't working or what have you. But I went through and eventually was able to get SDDC Manager fully deployed. As you can see on my screen, I have SDDC Manager deployed. You know, we've got, you know, VMware Cloud Foundation lifted up here, so it's like this is a operational deployment, right? So it's nested, 100%. It's not a production deployment, but it's one of those things where I wanted to get it working, and it did. Like I said, it took a week, a solid week, starting on a Friday, going through a weekend, and then the better part of last week monkeying around with it, trying to figure out what it was that I was doing wrong. Then there was licensing issues. I didn't have enough CPUs to do things. I would have NSX managers that would crash during the bring up. I ended up having to power them off and wait for them to come back online. I would run into all kinds of things. And my 2 successful deployments that I was able to get, this is the second time spinning it up, just so I could make sure that I could go through it a second time. And it wasn't a fluke getting it done the first time. The first time I deployed, I could not figure out why DNS wasn't working correctly inside of SDDC Manager. Because one of the things you can do in the networking settings is you can go in here and you have to create network pools and, you know, set DNS and do your NTP stuff. So you come underneath your workload domains and underneath your management domain, you have to add an edge cluster. This used to be part of the bring up process in older versions of VCF, but in newer versions they've taken it out of the bring up process and put this as one of the first steps you do once you're stood up. And once you're stood up, you'll deploy an edge cluster and get that all working. Well, for whatever reason, I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get the, so if I was to come in here and look at my edge cluster real quick, I have this guy right here, and as you can see, it's active, and I can expand it if I wanted to. I can add more nodes to my edge cluster. Well, what was happening was, and this is the first big takeaway, was, let me go ahead and get out of the way. I ended up having to, I've got DNS running here on my Windows Server 2019, and you need to create pointer records. So for literally everything that's inside of this forward lookup zone, you should have an associated pointer record to do reverse lookups. You know, instead of looking for the name, you look for the IP and it maps that to a name. So I did that, and that got the job done. So that was the first thing that I needed to figure out, and that allowed me to go, when you go to set up a new edge cluster, if I click here, let's just go ahead and say select all, and then you give it a name, right? You give it a name, whatever you're going to do, and then when you get to the edge cluster settings, you're going to have to give the FQDN of the edge node itself, and if it cannot resolve the IP address to a name, so again, a reverse lookup through the pointer record, it's going to fail, and it's not going to work. So that was one of the caveats. So I ended up, I actually blew SDDC all the way, thinking that there was a problem with SDDC, and it wasn't until a later point in time that I realized that it was a DNS issue on the server. So, you know, you live and you learn. So I circled back, I redeployed it again. It took a day or two in order to get it stood up again. Once I had it stood up, then I was able to go through and I fixed the DNS issues, got that resolved, and then the next big issue I ran into is I couldn't figure out why my NSX-T edge cluster deployment through SDDC was failing. And then I realized that from a ESXi segment connectivity, right? So you have a tier 0 gateway. You have it only does multi-tier routing, by the way, in SDDC. So you do a tier 0, a tier 1, and you map your segments to your tier 1. And I was getting route propagation from that, but for whatever reason, it was failing to deploy. And the reason why I was deploying is I wasn't redistributing on my edge device that gets a CAT 8000V. I wasn't redistributing OSPF into BGP in order to get the CAT 8KV to propagate routes down to the edge node. So it's looking for bidirectional route distribution. So once I fixed that, I was good to go. And that fixed all those problems. And then I was able to come in here and let me go ahead and log back in real quick. I asked me, don't upgrade. Okay. So now vSAN is what everything is deployed on top of, because that's really what VCF is. It's automating using all the best practices that VMware wants you to do. vSphere 7, vCenter 7, vSAN, NSX-T, the whole kit and caboodle, right? You have to provide all that information to the cloud builder. The cloud builder is what you are working in front of, and you're watching as this thing goes on and on and on and on. So vSAN is not something I'm super familiar with. So this is what NSX, what everything looks like once it's fully deployed. You have your management workload domain or cluster. These are the four management servers. They're ESXi hosts, and then I have the edge nodes right here. I have my 3 NSX-T nodes. This is my NSX-T cluster. Then I have vCenter server, and then down here at the bottom I have SDDC 01. This is the software. This is the SDDC manager, and I'm able to talk to it through all that connectivity. So everything's being managed on this particular cluster. Now I can go create other clusters and stuff like that, but you don't have to do that. You can do what they call a consolidated deployment. And a consolidated deployment means you're running on the existing hardware, or you add more hosts to this cluster. And the way you would do that is you'd come over here to your workload domains. You'd click inside of here, and then you can go to, hosts. You can assign hosts or unassigned hosts. You can click in here, and you can assign these to which way is it? So so you're able to I have a bunch of hosts here. These guys haven't. The intention that I had was to add 3 new nodes to try to test out doing a workload domain. And so the intention was to do that, come over here and work your way through the process. The drawback to it is when I get to licensing. So I don't have enough licenses, even though I've got vMug eval experience, I don't have enough licenses left over in order to do it. So that was the caveat. And you need to give each one of these boxes quite a bit of CPU, because they're going to be running a variety of things. Like it's these, I'm running NSX-T manager. I mean, you're looking at 3 gigahertz. I probably could downsize the licensing now that it's been figured out, and I could probably reduce the size. The drawback to it is if you do that in the beginning, I tried going with just 4 CPUs for the 4 boxes here and just go with 16 and try my best, and it was constantly crashing. Like I couldn't get even a single NSX-T manager to come up and be stable. So that was the issue that I was running into, and I was like, well, that stinks. So my goal was to actually do an entire video series on this and go through the process. You're doing a lot of your administration from here. As you can see, you got storage settings and stuff like that. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do. You can create workload domains and get them stood up, but then you're still inside of vCenter doing the lower level tasks. So think of SDDC Manager as your parent object, and then you have your vCenter objects. So in this case, you have SDDC Manager, then you have vCenter Server sitting below that. And then consider vCenter Server and NSX-T Manager as child objects to SDDC manager, because you can tell SDDC to do things on NSX manager, but then NSX manager is a parent object to the objects below it. So NSX-T manager is going to control the hosts, what they do from a networking perspective, and then you have your ESXi hosts that are going to be child objects to vCenter. So it's like a 3-tier architecture. So conceptually, it's pretty straightforward, right? You SDDC manager, NSX-T, and vCenter. Your vCenter is tend to be managed by SDDC manager at a higher level, and then your hosts are managed by NSX manager and vCenter. So logically, it makes sense. So I went through and I attempted to do some stuff with vSAN. I've got to go back and learn vSAN all over again, because what I did understand about it has apparently changed. So I need to spend some time learning vSAN. I was going to go through and do some learning on, I was going to do some training, I should say, on doing data center virtualization, cover that all, then do a bunch of stuff on NSX-T, and then do one big training on it as they correlate together pretty well, and then cover like multi-site and federations, and then do all of that. And then walking you through all those pieces, and then walk you through VMware Cloud Foundation and VCF, and go through all those pieces. Because what VCF does is all the hours that you spend doing all the manual clickety-click stuff and thinking about the architecture and putting together spreadsheets, VCF does that all for you. And it's actually pretty cool when it comes down to. So there's another capability known as the VLC, not the video player, but the VCF Lab Connector. It's supposed to be a way for you to demo this stuff in a home lab. I've only watched some videos and read some documentation on it. I have not actually gone through the process of playing with it yet. That is going to be like the next step for me to go through and do and see if doing it the normal, like if I had to do this in production, what would I do? And now I know. Now I personally wanted to know, how do you deploy edge clusters? How do you connect your edge clusters via BGP to the outside world and all that type of stuff? Now I know. I can do it. I'm confident in that area. I've got those skills now. So with that being said, I went through and I've got my tier 0 gateway. I've got my tier 1 gateway. I got some segments mapped to my tier 0 gateway. As you can see, I have an overlay segment that's got DHCP enabled on it. And again, I'm pretty familiar with NSX-T. And then I deployed a Linux box, and that Linux box is currently attached to ESXi2, again, a consolidated deployment. And so now I'm going to log into this guy for like the 4th time since I started talking here. And this guy has an IP address through DHCP, as you can see right there. If I go to Open Terminal and I type in ifconfig, I have an IP address of 192.168.10.11, and if I wanted to ping google.com, I have internet access. So pretty cool on how that still works. Now that was my intention, and what that shows or confirms to me is I can still leverage VCF to deploy everything, and then it still works. Now the drawback to this is I would not put VCF in front of data center virtualization or NSX-T out of the gate. You need to know how to do data center virtualization and NSX-T in order for it to do the job the way you need it to. In order to automate anything, you need to understand all the individual processes the automation is trying to do first. Anybody that does automation, I'm sure, will and back me up on that. It's one of the reasons why I've been so slow to get into automation, is because one, a lot of the automation tools out there, I'm not familiar with them. So because of the fact that I was studying for the deploy exam for NSX-T for a while, and I had to understand Postman and some Terraform, I'm starting to migrate myself, or I should say not migrate, I'm starting to incorporate more automation into what I do to try to make it faster and more effective in what I'm doing. So that's basically what I'm starting to get into now. VCF was the first major step for me when it comes to figuring out all the individual steps. A lot of reading, a lot of documentation, a lot of figuring stuff out, a lot of diving into Linux that I've never dealt before. You know, understanding Vim and cat and adjusting variables and diving into root and go back and forth and logs and tail and all that type of stuff that I was always just basically familiar with and becoming a little more comfortable with. So stuff that I've always wanted to dive into, I'm able to show. So now with this, by having this VM deployed and being able to ping the internet and stuff like that, it's not full blown internet, right? It's not. I couldn't go watch a Netflix video here. It's not that fast. It's fast enough to give me basic ping connectivity and stuff like that. But what it does prove to me is that if I was to find a more efficient way of doing VCF, then I could probably do more with it, and that's my goal, right? So I'm going to look at the lab connector as a possibility and do some research on that. But that'll come after I go through and walk you all through a bunch of data center and NSX-T componentry and see exactly how that stuff works, because that's my next big thing. Now, I know I did a video series about 6 months ago that was on data center, standing up everything inside of ESXi and then vCenter and all that good stuff, and then doing NSX-T on top of it, and I only got so far and then I stopped. That was because of the fact that I ended up getting sucked back into a project where I did a lot of NSX, and I literally took everything in that project. I had to do everything. Like there was routing, there was security, there was VPN, there were backups I had to do. So I had to like stop what I was doing and go spend a ton of time in documentation, figure out how to do all this stuff. So guess what? I know how to do all this stuff now. So there you have it. So what I'm going to do over the next little while, it's going to probably take a little bit of time for me to go through it, is you and I are going to go through a full data center virtualization deployment, and we're going to go through a full NSX-T deployment, because I'm in no hurry. So that's kind of where I sit with the whole capability now, is I want to go spend the time that I need to in order to get this stuff working and do a full stack deployment. Data center, and NSX-T, the whole kit and caboodle, and then you guys will be able to join me, because it'll be 2 different data centers. It'll be 2 different NSX implementations. We'll do multi-site, then we'll do federations, the whole gamut. We're going to be walking through it. I'm actually really looking forward to that, and going through those pieces and walking you guys through those steps. But with that being said, that's pretty much where we're at. So if you guys have any questions, drop a comment down below. Keep me in the loop on what's going on. I'll talk to all of you guys next time. Take it easy, guys.